Hello everyone, so in this lecture video I'm going to be talking about blood. Okay, so there are three main functions of blood, and those three main functions of blood, which is transportation, regulation, protection, can be better seen in this image, in this actual slide. If you take blood, you spin it down, what happens is blood gets separated into three main components: plasma, which is predominantly water, the buffy coat, which is white blood cells, and platelets, and then red blood cells. And this red blood cell, in this case, portion is actually called the hematocrit. So when we talk about hematocrit, we're actually talking about percent red blood cells. So talking about transportation, the most important thing that's transported in blood is oxygen, and oxygen is transported by erythrocytes or red blood cells. Okay, so 44% of whole blood, males actually have a higher density of red blood cells than females. Okay, in terms of other types of transportation, proteins actually do a lot of transportation. So previously we talked about hormones, and we talk about non-polar hormones being transported in the protein via other in the blood by other proteins, and those are actually transported by albumins in this case. All right, so albumins is actually a transportation mechanism as well, albeit in a lesser important role, like non-polar substances like hormones. Okay, so water obviously is about fluid balance, so that's about regulation. Okay, electrolytes is especially the bicarbonate ion is responsible for pH regulation, so that's another regulatory, in this case, function of blood. In terms of protection, there's actually two or three main types of protection, if you want to think about it. Protection from, in this case, pathogenic microorganisms, so we're talking about bacteria and viruses, and obviously from bleeding out. So in terms of protection from bleeding, right, from hemorrhage in this case, not hemorrhoids folks, but hemorrhage, we actually have platelets, and platelets cannot act by itself. Platelets and this other protein called fibrinogen together actually helps your blood clot. Okay, so in protection from pathogenic microorganisms like viruses and bacteria, we're actually talking more about this it's actually 6 type of white blood cells. White blood cells are actually called leukocytes. Platelets are actually called thrombocytes. In this case, there's actually 3 phils: neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Those 3 are actually called granulocytes because they have granules. And then we have monocytes and lymphocytes, which are called agranulocytes because they have no granules. Just to expand further, there's actually 2 types of lymphocytes. We actually have B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. Okay, so in terms of protection from pathogenic microorganisms, neutrophils are actually the first responders to, in this case, bacterial or any other invasion. If your tissue, if your skin is actually, in this case, compromised, neutrophils, macrophages and neutrophils actually are the first ones on the scene. Your monocytes are actually macrophages. So in the blood, they're called monocytes. Once they exit the blood, monocytes are actually called macrophages. And if you look at it, macro means large, and as you can see, they're huge, right, compared to the other white blood cells. And the reason why they're called macro and phages is because phages comes from the word phagocytes, which means they eat. In this case, foreign invaders in this case, right? Basophils is primarily responsible for allergies, so they actually create this substance called histamine. As you know, probably if you are allergic to stuff, you take antihistamines. And then eosinophils are responsible for this case for parasitic infections. If you have worms, fungal infections, eukaryotic infections, you actually have an elevated count for eosinophils. Okay. Now talking about B lymphocytes, there's 2 types of lymphocytes. You actually have B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. And T lymphocytes, one subset is actually responsible for clearing out, in this case, defective cells. So cancer cells can actually be, in this case, induced to, in this case, commit suicide. In terms of human cells, those are called apoptosis. So T lymphocytes can actually interact with a cancer cell and trigger the cancer cell to actually self-destruct. Okay, so 3 main functions, and those 3 main functions, again, in this case, is actually related to this slide. Protection from, in this case, pathogenic microorganisms and cancer cells. Okay, here, protection from bleeding, platelets and fibrinogen. Right, transportation, oxygen by erythrocytes and nonpolar substances by albumins. And water obviously is responsible for, in this case, water balance, and then electrolytes, specifically the bicarbonate ion for pH balance. Now, obviously, water also transports a lot of other nutrients and a lot of other wastes, so that is also can also be considered another function of blood. So oxygen is, hopefully you would sense that oxygen is the most important substance that's transported in blood. So there is a hormone called erythropoietin, EPO, okay, that actually helps you increase, in this case, red blood cell populations when you need it. So an example of decreased blood oxygen levels would be if you actually, in this case, live in a higher elevation. If you come from Wisconsin, if you're coming from Wisconsin and you travel, let's say, to Colorado for an extended period of time, in this case, high altitude actually means a decrease in oxygenation levels. So what happens is the receptors and control centers are actually both in the kidneys. Okay, so the receptor senses that you have a decreased blood oxygen level, and in response, the receptor and the control center, the kidneys, release the hormone erythropoietin, or EPO. So EPO does in this case, does one actual thing, right? So in this case, it actually triggers, in this case, the mitotic divisions of multiple red blood cells from your red bone marrow. Specifically, as you remember, it's from the spongy bone. Okay, so that, along with increased breathing, obviously, red blood cells cannot just do oxygenation by themselves. You need the respiratory system for that. Hopefully increases oxidation levels, and that if once your oxygen levels come back to normal, that in turn shuts off the receptor and the control centers. This is a negative feedback mechanism. Okay, so protective mechanism, one of the protective mechanisms again of blood is obviously like helping you stop bleeding. Like obviously blood is very important because it carries oxygen and it transports and it regulates stuff, so you don't want to lose too much blood. And again, if you lose too much blood, those are called stages of shock. But there are stages of hemostasis. Now, not homeostasis. Hemo means blood, stasis means stop, right? Hemostasis. So if you cut yourself, I don't know why this knife is all the way in the artery, by the way. This knife is really sharp and someone really went deep here. What happens is the first thing actually is arteries have we're going to learn later, has actually a very thick muscular layer, and that actually creates a spasm, and that spasm actually shuts, in this case, the break to a lesser extent. Okay? But what happens is then, in this case, collagen fibers exposed and platelets get activated with fibrinogen, and that creates the clot in this case. FYI, folks, this number 2 and 3, we're going to be talking about pretty soon. That's called the coagulation pathway. All right. So again, vascular spasm, platelet plug formation, and coagulation phase. Both of this is actually part of the coagulation pathway, if you want to think about it. And we're going to be talking about this pretty soon. It's going to be complicated, so you better hang on to your seats here. Okay? Here we go. So to the right is the list of, in this case, your multiple clotting factors. And on the left is actually the clotting pathway in this case. FYI, you guys can read all of these things. Okay, so I want you to have this so that you can refer which clotting factors actually involve, okay, in this case. One note, there is no factor 6. All right, there is no clotting factor 6. All right, that's unassigned. And clotting factor 4 is actually the calcium ion in this case. So calcium is actually quite very, very important in terms of, in this case, clotting, right? So you have two pathways. You have the intrinsic pathway and the extrinsic pathway. The intrinsic pathway happens when when the endothelium, or the inner layer of an artery or a blood vessel, is still intact, okay? And what happens is, both of these, there's actually similarities here. What happens is, if you see there's factor 11, and as you can see, factor 11A, A means it's activated. So this without an A means inactivated, with an A means activated. What activates factor 11 into factor 11A, or activated factor 11? It's factor 12A. Factor 12A, if you look at here, folks, is actually Hageman factor. And Hageman factor actually comes from platelets. Platelets, okay, basically puke out factor 12A when they make contact with collagen. Okay, so collagen is the triggering factor for factor 12A to activate factor 11. Okay, why does collagen activate platelets? Well, if you recall from your tissue subdivisions, collagen is deep from the epithelium, from the endothelium of an artery. So if there is an injury on the inside of a blood vessel, collagen fibers gets exposed, and that in turn sticks to platelets. And when platelets stick to collagen, they puke out Hageman factor, and that induces this whole cascade of activation. Okay? The extrinsic pathway, on the other hand, comes from tissue factor. Tissue factor is like collagen. Tissue factor is normally not exposed on the inner surface of a blood vessel. But if you cut yourself, if you cut, in this case, a blood vessel, what happens then is tissue factor then gets exposed, all right? And then that induces this other pathway called the extrinsic pathway, all right? So collagen, tissue factor, but both of them are normally not exposed to the inner layer of the blood vessels, but once they're exposed, they undertake this cascade, okay? So factor 7 becomes activated into factor 7A. Again, A means activated, okay? And then there's this cascade of things. The key here is, this is probably very, very confusing, and it is know what's the difference between the trigger between the intrinsic and extrinsic pathway. But eventually they come together, okay? They come together, and actually they come together in factor 10, okay? And that factor 10 in this case is actually all about thrombin. And thrombin, all what thrombin does, folks, is, if you recall from the previous slides, is it actually activates fibrinogen. Fibrinogen, anything with gen at the end, is actually inactive. With thrombin's presence, it actually activates fibrinogen. It becomes fibrin, the active form. And fibrin is actually like a mesh. It's actually like a scaffold that actually blocks sites of bleeding. Okay, so this is actually where your platelet plug, and your actual clot comes into play. All right. Now, fibrin by itself is very weak, so you need to cross-link the fibrin as well. All right. So the main key for all of this is platelet activation. So platelets, along with fibrin, okay, they create a plug at the site of tissue injury. Okay. Now, there's a lot of these other things where you actually see blue things. Blue things are actually, in this case, inhibitory to this pathway. Now, clotting pathway, folks, is a positive feedback. Once you start clotting, you're going to clot more. All right. So there has to be a control mechanism in which you actually, in this case, negate. You actually do not want to have uncontrolled clotting. One of the problems with clotting all over your body is called DIC, or disseminated intravascular clotting. So there's this actually thing called activated protein C, which in this case actually degrades, in this case, inactivates specific factors to prevent this whole cycle of having a clot going further. Protein C, by the way, folks, is vitamin K dependent. This is why you actually have problems with bleeding if you actually have vitamin K deficiencies. All right, so that's a very, very important thing. Hemophilia, if you've heard about hemophilia before, is when you actually are missing one of these clotting factors. Okay, and that means to say that you bleed out much more easier. So that's actually called hemophilia. If you've ever heard a factor of Leiden disease before, Leiden disease is actually you have a hyperactive factor 7. So if you have factor 7, hyperactive factor 7, you clot more because factor 7 then activates this whole pathway. So hemophilia is lack of clotting factors. Factor 7 Leiden disorder is actually an example of a hyperactive clotting mechanism. Okay, so again, just remember that, like inactive, there's no A, active means A. Make sure that you understand the difference about how these two pathways actually get triggered. And also note in this whole clotting pathway how important platelets are. CPL means platelets, and actually calcium are. Okay, so calcium, without calcium ions, the clotting pathway actually does not occur. And without platelets, the clotting pathway does not occur. So there's a lot of, you don't have to remember all of this. Know the different triggers. Okay, collagen activates platelets. Okay, and platelets activates factor 11. All right, Hageman factor, extrinsic pathway, you actually have tissue factor that's normally not exposed. Once you cut a blood vessel, it gets exposed on the inner layer, and that activates this whole pathway. And again, the common pathway where these two actually meet is actually the creation of thrombin. And thrombin, folks, again, the whole purpose of thrombin is to activate fibrinogen into fibrin.